Welcome. I am delighted to open this hearing on the Western Hemisphere Committee, and we will now come to order. Before I begin my remarks, I just want to give a shout out to the good senator from Virginia to my right and tell him how much I appreciate the opportunity to work together with him on this. We had a chance to meet a little earlier in this week, and there are a lot of really good bipartisan issues for this committee to delve into, and delighted and honored to sit next to you here, Senator. Thank you. I used to be a Virginian, and we were talking. He was serving on the city council in the city where I lived when I lived in Virginia, and it's interesting how things turn out. Today marks 5 years since my bill, the Taiwan Allies International Protection and Enhancement Act, Taipei Act, was signed into law. This bipartisan act that I sponsored in the House, which passed unanimously through Congress, has been pivotal in protecting Taiwan's remaining diplomatic allies from Beijing's coercion. The Taipei Act strengthens Taiwan's position in the world by promoting deeper trade with Taiwan, supporting Taiwan's participation in international organizations, and most importantly, protecting Taiwan's relations with its allies. In short, it sent a loud message of U.S. support for Taiwan, making clear that we stand with our democratic partners and will not tolerate attempts to isolate Taiwan. I'm proud of the Taipei Act's legacy and hope this subcommittee hearing serves as reaffirmation of this 5-year anniversary. The Taipei Act came as a response to Beijing's intensified campaign in the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific aimed at prying away Taiwan's allies. In Latin America and the Caribbean, this pressure is increasing. Specifically, the Taipei Act came as a response to Panama, the Dominican Republic, and El Salvador switching diplomatic recognition. Not only did they switch diplomatic recognition, but they adopted China's One China's principle, or China's claim that Taiwan is part of China. Honduras became the latest to switch recognition in 2023, severing its 82-year alliance with Taiwan after making exorbitant demand for billions in aid that Taiwan wasn't able to fill, but Beijing did for a price. Even regional institutions have not been spared. The Central American Parliament was pressured to expel Taiwan's observer and replace it with China, underscoring the breadth of China's influence campaign in our backyard. Beijing's tactics in our hemisphere are increasingly blatant. State Department officials have rightfully likened China's approach in our region to the 19th century imperialism, bribing local leaders with investments in ways that lead to debt dependency. Make no mistake, China's goal is to isolate Taiwan completely, with the goal of silencing international dissent if China forces unification on Taiwan, and it is deploying every tool at its disposal to achieve that end in our very own hemisphere. It is squarely in the United States' national interest to push back against Beijing's encroachment in our own backyard and to support those nations that continue to stand with Taiwan. China's influence efforts in the Western Hemisphere threaten not only Taiwan's position in the world, but also global stability and U.S. interest. We must respond with equal resolve. That means redoubling our engagement with Taiwan's remaining allies to ensure they have strong economic and security incentives to stick with Taiwan. The Taipei Act charts that course. The U.S. should prioritize support and diplomatic engagement with countries that maintain ties with Taiwan and consider downgrading relations with those who bow to Beijing. This aligns with the Trump administration goal of ensuring our dollars spent abroad are making America more safe, secure, and prosperous. That is why I will join a bipartisan group of House and Senate colleagues next week to introduce the Taiwan Allies Fund Act, which I view as a natural follow-up to the Taipei Act. This bill sets aside a portion of the already appropriated Countering PRC Malign Influence Fund to focus on helping countries that stand strong in the face of PRC pressure and maintain our strengthened ties with Taiwan. We cannot allow the Chinese Communist Party to buy out Taiwan's friends in our own backyard. We will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Taiwan and help it shore up its allies, countering Beijing's coercion at every turn. Taiwan's allies in this hemisphere have shown courage and loyalty in the face of intense pressure. The United States will not abandon them. On the contrary, we will strengthen our alliances with these partners, rejecting authoritarian influence. Together, we send a clear message. Taiwan is not alone, and the Western Hemisphere will not become a playground for the PRC. With that, I'd like to yield to the distinguished ranking member for his comments. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I am very happy to be holding this hearing on a really important topic. I want to congratulate Senator Kurnas on his chairmanship of this subcommittee and on this first hearing. As he indicated, we talked and we feel like there's much work that we can, good work that we can do together. And I want everybody to know that the The title of this subcommittee might be the longest of any subcommittee in the United States Senate. This is the Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, Transnational Crime, Civilian Security, Democracy, Human Rights, and Global Women's Issues. And by tradition, while most of our hearings will likely be focused on the Western Hemisphere, we feel like we've got a pretty broad latitude to do human rights, democracy promotion, other important issues, and I relish that opportunity. The chairman and I have some similarities. As he mentioned, he lived in Richmond when I was starting my career in public life as a city councilman there, but we also were both missionaries. He did his missionary work in Taiwan. I did my missionary work in Honduras, and so my passion for the Americas is driven by that, but that's something that we share. The hearing today is very much driven, I know, by Senator Kernus's work as a legislator, but also his personal experience. Congratulations on the 5-year anniversary of the Taipei Act. I actually remember it well. So this was a House bill, but the SFRC had a similar bill, and we worked on it in 2019 over what was a landmark bill, but also a bipartisan one. We can do good work together, and we need to keep doing it. We've got a great panel this morning. I want to thank you, Mr. Ellis. It's always good to have you here and to see you again. But I have to admit a particular pride in welcoming Samantha Custer of William & Mary's AidData Center Initiative, which is a program that was founded in collaboration between William & Mary, BYU, and Senator Curtis's home state of Utah, and also UT Austin. And you need to know, Samantha, that sitting behind you is one of the best talent pools that anybody with a college should be interested in. This is Thomas Jefferson High School, Day on the Hill. So these are all TJ seniors, one of the best public high schools in the United States. So do really well, and you might convince some of these guys that William & Mary is where they should go. We've got an opportunity today to deepen our discussion on the important topic that is bipartisan, the clear national security interest to ensure that the U.S. in its diplomatic, economic, and security partner of choice in the region, and that China's efforts to influence folks in the region to pull away from the U.S. and support policies counter to the U.S. are not successful. The U.S. and the 34 neighbors that we share in this hemisphere share deep ties, economy, family ties, cultural, historical ties, and we need to make sure that we're building off that foundation and off that history rather than taking steps that push our allies away from us or letting them drift away from us without paying sufficient attention. U.S. assistance and engagement are vital to countering threats to national security. We have an essential role to play in bolstering the stability of the region. When we do that, when we help the regional economies and regional political stability, we not only benefit these neighbors that are our friends, but we also reduce issues like narco-trafficking or migration flows to the United States. So we're very, very tied together. Every crisis in the region that affects people in the region affect our homeland too. And there are two reasons why China is moving so aggressively into the region and why we have to be equally strategic in our response. Not only is the PRC trying to box us into a corner in our own neighborhood, they're also really coming hard after Taiwan's diplomatic partners, often at the cost of prosperity and good governance. The PRC's tactics in the region bring significant corruption, economic degradation, environmental challenge, and we've seen that again and again and again in the region. The area where I think it's been most manifest to me is in the relationship that the PRC has had over many years with Ecuador, that has left Ecuador victimized by illegal fishing around the Galapagos, environmental despoliation around drilling or substandard infrastructure projects, and that has put Ecuador in a real jam. And Ecuador in recent years has been more open to interacting with the U.S. because they've seen the cost of deep engagement with China. The PRC is very, very focused on the issue of Taiwan and the fact that in this region, in the Americas, have been some of the most long-standing ties between nations and Taiwan. Now, our U.S. joint assistance programs with Taiwan have bolstered Taiwan's diplomatic partnerships in the area. The chair mentioned some of the areas where we have partners in the region drifting away from Taiwan or changing their policy, but as an example, in February 2024, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation signed an agreement with its counterpart in Taiwan to advance private sector investments around the world, and the landmark program is focused on the Western Hemisphere and the Indo-Pacific. Direct U.S. foreign assistance is one of the several important tools for countering PRC advances in the region, but the status of some of these foreign assistance programs is very much in question right now in the early months of the Trump administration, and we want to try to make sure that we're using tools at our disposal to do what I know is the Trump administration very much wants to counter Chinese dominance. They very much want to do that, and you see that in military investments, et cetera. But one of the ways we counter Chinese dominance is also in the humanitarian aid, diplomatic space, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about that today. Trade, leveraging private sector partnership is another one of the great tools we have. The PRC is disrupting commercial exchanges with countries such as Guatemala, and they're exerting pressure on other countries like Paraguay as a means of coercing them into compliance with Taiwan policies. So there can be short-term gains for some nations in doing this, but often at the cost of long-term stability and prosperity. So shared values of democracy, freedom of expression, rule of law need to remain at the core of our engagement. In this way, too, supporting democratic Taiwan's ties throughout the region is in our collective interest. I'll turn it back over to the chair so we can begin the hearing. And there is a vote occurring during this hearing, so you'll probably, see us leave at different times. You may see other colleagues joining and leaving as votes are underway, just to explain that. But yield back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and we'll just deal with that as it comes at us. I think you all are familiar with the drill here in Washington. Thank you, Senator. Dr. Evan Ellis is a research professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, with a focus on the region's relationships with China and other non-Western Hemisphere actors, as well as transnational organized crime and populism in the region. Dr. Ellis is the leading expert on the China-Latin American relations and has published hundreds of works on the subject. Dr. Ellis has also served on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff as the office responsible for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as international narcotics and law enforcement issues. Dr. Ellis, the floor is yours. I think you understand the 5-minute limits and the lights, so you're welcome to begin.
Chairman Curtis, Ranking Member Kane, thank you very much for the opportunity to share my work and thoughts with you here today. Since 2005, PRC-based companies have invested $203 billion in Latin America, and its bilateral trade with the region has reached $500 billion. China has also built significant people-to-people networks in the region, including 44 Confucius centers. It provides paid trips for numerous academics, politicians, police, and military, and even judges. It similarly pays for trips for journalists to the region, including Lido Rubin and Kike Gamara of Paraguay, as well as Juan Canel Cabrera and Claudia Mendez of Guatemala, among many. It supplies free media content reflecting PRC narratives. It curries favor with chambers of commerce in the region, as well as friendship caucuses in their legislatures. It does all of this to buy goodwill, access, and intelligence. The PRC's dominant position in the region's digital infrastructure includes Huawei in telecommunications and cloud services, including the Mexican government and other governments in the region, as well as Hikvision and surveillance systems and NUCTEC custom scanners. These create risks both of espionage and also intellectual property theft. China also props up authoritarian regimes such as Venezuela, not only through loans, but also through systems that support repression, including riot control vehicles and facial recognition cameras for tracking down protesters. If the PRC starts a war with the U.S., its surveillance facilities in Cuba and its commercial operations close to the U.S. could be used as launch points to disrupt U.S. force deployment and sustainment. In Panama, beyond Hutchison's not yet sold 2 ports, the operations of Costco, CCCC, and numerous other Chinese companies give it the combination of physical presence, technical knowledge, and relationships that could allow it to shut down the canal. The China-friendly firm Notarc has assets from the defunct China Land Bridge venture, which it may use in a new bid for the Panama Colón container port. In Peru, Costco's exclusive control over the port of Chancay could allow it to resupply PLA naval forces in the Eastern Pacific in time of war. PRC access to space from the Western Hemisphere, not only the PLA-operated facility in Neuquén, Argentina, but also others in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Chile, including Venturones, could also be used and allow it to target U.S. satellites and also to attack the U.S. from space during time of war. With respect to Taiwan, for me, our partner's survival as an autonomous, democratic entity is crucial for peace in Asia and also to limiting PRC projection in the Pacific as well as in the Americas. As the number of states recognizing Taiwan dwindles, CCCP confidence that it can end Taiwan's autonomy at an acceptable cost grow, increasing the risk for all of us of a major war. In the last 7 years, as you noted, 5 of the 12 nations in this hemisphere that recognize Taiwan have abandoned it for the PRC. The results for those who switched have been largely negative. Indeed, none of those who switched meaningfully increased either exports or actual Chinese investment from that move. Moreover, their PRC imports grew rapidly, harming local businesses. Those diplomatic switches also allowed the PRC to rapidly expand its presence and influence through MOUs, free trade agreements, training programs for government officials, Confucius Institutes, infrastructure projects, and paid trips to the PRC. Of Taiwan's remaining friends, Paraguay's President Santiago Peña remains steadfast. Still, the PRC is constantly wooing Paraguay's elites. I note, for example, the case of PRC agent Xu Hui, who entered the country under false pretenses to lobby the Paraguayan Congress. In the Caribbean, the March 12th election victory of the incumbent People's United Party decreases the risk of change there. Still, small governments, including St. Kitts and Nevis, including also St. Vincent's and the Grenadines and St. Lucia, are tempted by the money of Chinese investors. In Haiti, frankly, I worry about Vivan Sam and a possible takeover leading to a lawless criminal government who would be tempted to turn to the PRC for financing. My recommendations to the committee include, number 1, supporting programs to build partner institutional capacity to limit PRC advance, including the evaluation of contracts and investments, fighting corruption, and overseeing Chinese commercial and other activities. 2, an expanded and less constrained development finance corporation to leverage private sector good U.S. investment. Number 3, leveraging democratic partners in Asia and Europe in order to finance and win projects to deny that space to the PRC. Farther DoD, DHS, and intelligence community preparation for likely PRC actions not only in the Indo-Pacific but also in the Western Hemisphere in time of war. Strengthened messaging on the U.S. commitment to Taiwan, including, and I believe this is very important, CODELs and staffdels there, as well as defense and technology assistance supported by this Congress. And finally, greater State Department and other U.S. government coordination with Taiwan, including, in my judgment, privileged treatment for those states recognizing it, both in terms of economic matters and also in international organizations. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. We'll wait for just a minute. Okay, excuse me. Samantha Custer is the Director of Policy Analysis for AidData. AidData was formed in 2009 as a partnership between universities in the states of both Senator Kaine and myself, William & Mary and Brigham Young University, and Development Gateway to provide global development stakeholders with more granular and comprehensive data on foreign assistance projects worldwide, including efforts by China and other adversaries to leverage their assistance programs into concrete policy gains. She holds a dual master's in foreign service and foreign service and public policy from Georgetown University and has a 20-year track record of leading teams and supporting evidence-based decision-making as an international relations scholar practitioner. Ms. Custer, the floor is yours.
Chairman Curtis, Ranking Member Kaine, thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts on China's influence and the status of Taiwan's diplomatic allies in the Western Hemisphere. My remarks today are my own views. They don't represent the official position of William & Mary, AidData, our funders, or our partners. Beijing and Taipei are locked in a contest for influence in the Western Hemisphere. One of the PRC's stated aspirations is reunification of Taiwan with the Chinese mainland. Latin America is a strategically important battleground to advance the same in 2 respects. First, Beijing wants to peel away Taipei's support in a region home to over half of the countries that still officially recognize Taiwan. Second, operating in America's backyard is an opportunity for the PRC to deter Washington from coming to Taipei's aid. A decade ago, 22 countries worldwide maintained full diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Today, this number is down to 12. Half of the defectors were from Latin America. Of Taiwan's remaining allies, 7 are in Latin America. These holdout countries are outliers in continuing to recognize Taiwan and host its embassy even as their peers defect. 7 additional countries straddle a middle ground. They're what I would call fence sitters. They tacitly engage with Taipei on economic and cultural issues via a representative liaison office, but stop short of official recognition. Taiwan and its allies must work to prevent slippage of additional countries moving down the recognition chain from official to tacit recognition to no relations at all. Taipei's economic statecraft has been outmatched in Latin America. Beijing exploits economic asymmetry to pressure leaders to back its preferred policies, including derecognition of Taiwan. Over 2 decades, the PRC bankrolled nearly 2,500 development projects in Latin America worth $300 billion. But this money is not without strings attached. For each dollar of aid it supplied, Beijing provided $28 of debt for projects expected to generate commercial returns. Holdout countries that recognize Taiwan cannot access these funds. Conversely, those who make the diplomatic pivot to adopt the One China policy are handsomely rewarded. Taiwan is well regarded as a development partner, but it operates with little scale and visibility. Its budget is in the hundreds of millions per year, but financing is on more generous terms. Cash-strapped economies have signaled that they may be willing to stop recognize Taiwan in exchange for assistance. Announcements of new projects bankrolled by Beijing followed quickly on the heels of a country changing its policy. PRC development finance is deployed to crowd in Chinese trade and FDI in similar sectors and geographies. Critical minerals such as copper and lithium were priorities, as well as investing in companies involved in power generation, electricity distribution, and mineral extraction. Latin America saw a 22-fold increase in trade with China over nearly 2 decades, and Chinese FDI to the region was worth $9 billion in 2023 alone. Prior to derecognition, Latin American countries saw sizable drops in the share of exports to China. Following a pivot, trade with the PRC rose, declined with Taiwan, and several countries signed new trade and investment agreements with Beijing. Comparatively, Taipei's economic statecraft is disjointed. Despite its comparative advantage as a leading producer of semiconductors, Taiwan's direct trade and investment with the region is very modest, while its aid is focused mostly in the social sectors. So rather than asking why Taiwan has lost some of its diplomatic allies, we should consider why it has not yet lost all of them. Holdout countries like Paraguay, Guatemala, and Haiti have 2 reasons to recognize Taiwan. They might be concerned about ideological affinity. They may also see alternative economic opportunities such as US trade or humanitarian assistance flows. Fence sitters like Brazil or Chile have a strategic rationale for holding the middle ground. They may have a foreign policy based on neutrality, or they may capture economic or political gains from playing both sides, doing just enough to satiate Beijing, but still aiming to please the US. Of course, holdout countries still face pressure from their citizens in Beijing to change course, and the strategic calculus for these fence sitters could shift with uncertainty in US trade policy. So to help Taiwan retain existing allies and attract new ones, I want to talk about 3 lines of effort for the US. Expanding co-financing and co-branding of US development cooperation efforts in the Western Hemisphere with Taiwan. Prioritizing renewal of things like the Generalized System of Preferences and strengthen aid for trade that help Taiwan's allies in the region utilize duty-free access to US markets. And finally, promote cooperation between American, Taiwanese, and Latin American firms to build resilient supply chains in critical industries. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Custer. We're going to excuse my ranking member. We're going to excuse the ranking member for just a moment, and then we'll switch roles and vote. So he's demonstrated a lot of confidence in me to leave me here by myself. I want to go off script just a little bit, because I think it's really important for anybody watching this today to understand why this matters. So Dr. Evans and then Ms. Custer, if you would start, why does this matter? Why does hanging on to these countries matter for the United States?
Senator, it's an excellent point, and I think one that's very important for us to be clear on. So first of all, from the perspective of the conflict or the rivalry with the PRC, understanding that as the number of allies that Taiwan has goes towards zero, in the context of increasing military and other superiority in Asia by the PRC, the temptation is that brings us closer to a war in Asia. The extent to which Taiwan is seen as not isolated, I think, at least is one of the factors that keeps us farther away from that war. Also understanding that if Taiwan is lost as an autonomous democratic ally in Asia, that geographically allows the PLA and PLA Navy to project itself out beyond Guam into the Indo-Pacific to Hawaii and to the U.S. coast. But also looking just at Latin America and the PRC economic but also military and political advance in Latin America. The way, and I've shown this time and time again in my own research, the most rapid way for the PRC to advance in military and economic terms is when you have a flip, because that flip is associated with non-transparent MOUs. It is associated with often free trade agreements, which open up markets to PRC companies in sectors like electricity and telecommunications and others. It's typically associated with the establishment of Confucius Institutes, training programs for government officials, and a range of other things. And frankly, if we look at which states still continue to recognize Taiwan, they are states ever closer to the United States. They're in the Caribbean, in the U.S., maritime approaches, as well as in Central America if we talk about Guatemala and Belize. In other words, it becomes a national security imperative and really one of the best ways to push back against the PRC. And frankly, at the end of the day, also for both the region itself and also for the United States, Taiwan is an excellent democratic ally. It's a partner with very good development projects, even if at a smaller scale. And it's a good partner for coordinating to push forward democracy and help to address and promote the conditions in the region of the types of regimes that we in the U.S. would like to have.
Thank you.
I would add to that three things. So first, it matters economically. Taiwan is the leading supplier and producer of semiconductors in the world that the U.S. economy relies upon. So not only would it disrupt our economy, but some estimates indicate that if Taiwan were to fold, that would have probably about a 10% disruption to the global economy. So that's big.
That's a big deal.
Geopolitically, the U.S. is actively trying to advance its interests with the PRC across the globe. If we fold on Taiwan, if we see diplomatic allies being hemorrhaged away from Taiwan, that gives China essentially a major victory in this competitive battle. And then finally, from a security perspective, I think the more that countries in the region tip into China's camp away from Taiwan, that increases exposure for the U.S. to things like these dual-use ports, these emphases on space observatories and like that strengthen China's hand.
So just a point on that, you mentioned the 10% hit. I think that's to our GDP. To put that in comparison, the Great Depression was 7%. So you want to understand what type of an impact, that's dramatic. Thank you. I also want to use this opportunity to point out, oftentimes when we have these conversations, it feels like we're talking about the Chinese people, and I want to be really clear. I think Americans love the Chinese people, love the Chinese culture. That's not where our problem is. It's an authoritarian government that's more oppressive on its own people than anyone else. And I just think that's really important to designate for our conversation. Dr. Ellis, let's go to the Panama Canal. You mentioned that just briefly, and I think you rightly said that these two ports were not yet transferred, but we've got some hope here that these are moving out of those hands. After Secretary Rubio's visit, Panama announced it was pulling out of the Belt and Road Initiative, which it joined when it switched diplomatic recognition. Given these developments, is there a pathway to get Panama at least to upgrade their relationships with Taiwan and perhaps give some type of representation, even if it's a representative's office or something like that? How do you see that playing out there in Panama?
Senator, I think it's a great and important question, and I think I would address three different pieces. Number one, I think the Belt and Road changeover, Panama's renouncing of the Belt and Road was important, but it's important also to recognize that it was symbolic. It contractually doesn't necessarily get the United States any greater security, but again, I think it's a move in the right direction, and we should continue to press for that option with other states in the region as well. With respect to a representative office, a TECRO type office, again, I think that's a possibility. But I think both the administration, the Secretary Rubio at State, and this Congress should be ready to fully defend it. I remember when our friends in Guyana, the Irfan Ali government, a couple of years back, tried to allow Taiwan to open up an office, and the PRC pressure was so strong that within, I think, 3 hours, they were forced to double back on that. And so I think we should absolutely press for that as a doable thing, but we should be ready to defend it. And the other thing I think is we have some opportunity as we move in the right direction with respect to the BlackRock deal, but we should also be attentive to the fact that Chinese actors in the PRC are trying to reverse that deal, even with their delegation that came just days ago. Also, there are risks from other operators such as Costco, such as the possibility of a new Panama clone container port in which the China-friendly company No Torque could operate, as well as actors such as Huawei and others. And so I think we need to continue to be vigilant in that area, and certainly be prepared to not only press forward, but also follow through in things like TECRO offices.
Thank you.
Adding to that, I think there is a momentum that we're seeing in Panama right now. You think about the fact that Panama is one of only 2 countries in the world that has announced that it's backing out of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and that's significant. In terms of this recognition chain that I talked about before, from no relations to the tacit kind of liaison office to the full, I think the risks for countries in the region, or the pain that they feel, is highest when they go all the way to full recognition. That middle ground, the fence sitters don't seem to be paying as much of a cost to do that. So I think with the right economic incentives, the right support from the U.S., there definitely could be an opportunity to get a liaison office in Panama.
Thank you. All right. I'm told I need to go vote. Will our good witnesses tolerate just a pause here? And I will be back. And if Senator Kane returns before I do, he's authorized to start again, and then I'll be back as quick as I can. Thank you for understanding.
recess. And I'm going to ask some questions, and I know that the chair will come back and we'll probably have a bit of a dialogue. Dr. Ellis, I wanted to ask you, just elaborate a little bit more on what you said about what China is doing right now in Guatemala and Paraguay. So Paraguay has been very, very solid in support of Taiwan and resisting PRC influence. The new Arevalo government, slightly over a year old in Guatemala, I think has been a real breath of fresh air in that country domestically, trying to push back against a culture of corruption. They had to kind of work through their own version of January 6th on the day that President Arevalo was inaugurated in January of 2024. But talk a little bit about what the PRC is doing in both of those countries to kind of break them away from their support for Taiwan.
Senator Kaine, thank you for the question. So first of all, to put it in general context, as you know very well, in all of the countries, there is a constant process of lobbying. That lobbying often involves the courting of local elites, sometimes bringing them over to the PRC, whether through business opportunities or through consulting opportunities, paid trips. That also includes journalists to try to frame the debate. As a complement, you also see a number of different activities with respect to what I would call economic blackmail, the promise of how much more one could export, usually a false promise if one only changed relations, and the pressure to saying, well, if you don't change, then you're not going to get even what you're getting today. And so that pattern applies in both countries. And so in Paraguay, because it is a very important meat exporter, as you know, a lot working especially through Nadera and Noble that China bought about 10 years ago, is some of the agro-logistics firms, a lot of whispering in the ear of the Paraguayan agriculturalists that if only you changed relations, you could sell so much more. But on top of that, you also see some what I call surreptitious lobbying. I mentioned the Chinese agent Xu, who was basically entered supposedly for to give a talk and tried to lobby in the Paraguayan Congress. And on top of that, you also have, I think, some threats to make Paraguayan exports difficult. I have had the fortune of being able to engage with Paraguayan government, including with President Peña, and I know that because of his background with the Colorado Party, there is a certain, at least, principled determination there. But again, the threats are always there. With respect to Guatemala, of course, slightly different challenge with a Arevalo government, but again, the same promises of agricultural exports, the same type of lobbying. I mentioned in my initial testimony the number of different Guatemalan and Paraguayan reporters that are brought over. The one woman that I mentioned with her program Concretario, which is a very influential Guatemalan program, she was brought over for 3 months for a orientation trip to the PRC, and those type of things are not common. So you have that. And indeed, when President Arevalo first came in, and he was trying to walk that delicate balance that so many of our friends are, trying to say, well, we want to have the economic benefits of the PRC, and at the same time, continue politically with our Paraguayan friends. There was a moment, and the PRC is very good at doing this, where they cut off critical exports of, I believe it was a type of Guatemalan nuts, essentially to send a warning that, if you don't switch over, even what you're getting now could be lost. But again, I think the principled stance of President Arevalo in sticking with our Taiwanese allies has continued apace. But again, those pressures are there for both, sir.
Do you have something, Ms. Custer, you want to add in? Please.
Yes, please. In my written testimony, I talked about how Beijing's approach in Latin America, the economics is the cornerstone, but the information operations and the public diplomacy that Dr. Ellis was talking about is exactly the megaphone that amplifies these things. I very much agree with Dr. Ellis's observations. I would add a little bit more to say that China is playing this out in two dimensions. One is that it is trying to engage indirectly by tapping into this fear of missing out. It's really interesting when you look at the post-2016 defectors in Central America, Panama 2017, the DR 2018, El Salvador 2018, Nicaragua 2021, Honduras 2023. Countries are looking at each other. They're seeing what their neighbors are getting for partnering with China, and that is a very, very powerful story. Interestingly enough, too, in addition to the Paraguay example you provided, Dr. Ellis, I would also add there was an interesting anecdote about China's interactions with Paraguay during the COVID-19 pandemic. and essentially using access to vaccines as a stick and a carrot, I guess you could say, to try to pull off Paraguay.
I have many questions, but here's one. Is the Chinese sort of MO in interacting with countries in the Americas different in any significant way from their theory of the case when they're interacting with African countries or other Asian countries? And if so, describe a little bit how it's different.
Maybe I'll speak to that first. So I'm a comparativist by nature, so I look at this across different regions. And so I had a starting point when I looked at China and Latin America, and there is a remarkable similarity in how China engages. Economically, again, is the cornerstone. It leverages the interplay very well of development finance, trade, and investment, and then uses all of these public diplomacy information strategies to boost its voice. But I think what is unique and interesting about the Latin America case specifically, one is that the emphasis on derecognition of Taiwan. You see quite a significant split. And it's a two-track system. Those that play ball with China on Taiwan get all of the goodies, and those that do not are locked out. And so that comes out in starker relief here. And then I think there's also some unique concerns regarding the dual-use ports and some of the other investments that it's making in strategic industries in Latin America just because of the geographic proximity to the U.S.
Dr. Ellis.
So I also, as a comparativist, fully agree and appreciate that. And for me, what's interesting is that we do find lessons looking at what the PRC has done in Africa, what the PRC has done in Central and Eastern Europe, corresponding to a study that I did not too long ago. And not surprisingly, again, these policies come from the same Chinese culture, that they come from the same organizations, both the commercial side and governmental, in Beijing and in Shanghai. But there are differences that reflect the geographical imperatives, the composition of governments, the different cultural legacies, for example, China's involvement with the legacy of decolonialization in Africa and some of its relationships there. And when we talk about geography, certainly what you do see is that on the one hand, again, 7 of the 12 nations in the world that continue to recognize that Taiwan are found in this area. And oh, by the way, if you look at it from the perspective of the military, and I've worked in support of DoD my entire career, you can't help but noticing that the vast majority, with the exception of Paraguay, are dramatically close to strategic United States facilities from Central America, from the Caribbean. And so the opportunity for a flip is as much strategic in terms of the PRC's advance as it is from the isolation of Taiwan. And one of the other things that I just wanted to point out is the role of Chinese companies. While typically the promise of selling things comes later, but it is of note that there are certain companies that do operate even in countries that recognize Taiwan. Specifically, Huawei comes to mind. And what one finds is that oftentimes Huawei acts as the unofficial representative in trying to curry some of that favor. But there are absolutely lessons to be learned from what the PRC is doing elsewhere to how it is approaching Taiwan and the Americas.
So I'm going to make a critical comment and ask some questions that are critical of Trump administration activities in the Americas. But I'm always duty-bound to say something good if there's something good to say, and there is. I think the announcement that the president made around the time of the State of the Union about the acquisition of the Panamanian ports by BlackRock from the Hong Kong syndicate Hutchinson, that was real positive. And it could have gone in a much worse direction for the United States, and I know the administration was strongly behind that, encouraging it. That's a plus. And I know from being on the Armed Services Committee and looking at investments that are being made, even as the White House and the Secretary of Defense are looking for cuts at the Pentagon, they're exempting things like Indo-Pacific. They clearly are recognizing the pacing threat is China. But I'm really worried about things like the decision to de-escalate or shutter the Inter-American Foundation, some of the pausing of USAID contracts, because I think that sends a message that the U.S. is retreating from some of these areas, and China is not going to retreat. In fact, they see anything that looks like a retreat. They want to flood the zone and put more resources in. As I'm interacting with heads of state in the Americas and warning them about, beware of the apple presented by China because it might have a razor blade in it, they say we're pretty sophisticated in recognizing the challenges of Chinese offers, but you have to have something on the table. It can't just be, we're going to turn down interaction with the Chinese unless you have something on the table. And they frankly view what we have had on the table for quite some time as being woefully inadequate. Now, I think they're partially correct, and then there's partially a messaging problem on our side because they don't give us credit for everything the American companies are doing in their area. So they kind of set that aside. They're looking at what the U.S. government has on the table, and they find that to be significantly less than what the Chinese government or Chinese industries run by government have on the table. So we need to do a better job through things like the DFC and others to really package what the U.S. is doing. But how much does it hurt us when soft power levers like the Inter-American Foundation or USAID or other investments are being kind of put into question right now?
Thank you, Senator Kaine. So I think I would start by saying that when you're talking about how the U.S. engages in Latin America now and moving forward, one of the key things that we need to be thinking about is demonstrating that we have a Latin America strategy, not just a countering China strategy. And that Latin America strategy needs to be about shared prosperity, shared security. But then the question is, okay, that's nice rhetoric, that's nice language. What are you going to do to show, not just tell, that this is happening? And I think here, this is where I would say our economic statecraft levers of development finance, trade, and investment are critical. All of them are critical. I think that, there's nervousness about what some of the changes that the Trump administration are enacting with regard to foreign assistance, development assistance. It is provoking questions about, is this lever going away? Is this tool of statecraft going away? I think I'd be the first to say that there is a lot about U.S. development assistance that is in need of reform and that benefits from reform. But I think the abruptness of how those changes were made created questions rather than answers for people. Of course, we still have muscular tools like the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Development Finance Corporation, that can be used to continue to engage on this lever. And then there's a question about packaging, I think you also said, Senator Kaine, and that is one of the unique things I think it is about living in a democracy and a robust market economy like the United States that's different than our competitor in China, and that is the private sector, civil society, private philanthropies. So many different actors engage, American companies engage in Latin America, but you're right, it's very difficult to pinpoint who they are, what they're doing. And so for that reason, I think we do need to be talking about a whole of society contribution. One of the things that I've been working on with the State Department in other regions of the world that would be beneficial to do in Latin America is trying to quantify what is the value economically of engaging with the U.S.? What does that look like in terms of private sector trade and investment? What does that look like in terms of development finance? Our ambassadors and diplomats don't have easy answers to those questions.
Dr. Ellis.
No. Thank you very much, Senator. An excellent question. First of all, my understanding is coming from an academic standpoint, but recalling some of the same answers that I gave during a previous hearing, I believe, in front of yourself and the Foreign Relations Committee not too long ago. I think there's a range of different things. As you pointed out, number one, recognizing that the appropriate use of national power, and again, I think that's something that Secretary Rubio and others understand, to make our adversaries know that we care and make our partners know that we care. And so to me, as I mentioned with Senator Curtis, the importance of having this at least momentary victory with BlackRock, with Hutchison, but also the follow through to make sure that deal is not foiled. Also, I think one thing that's important that is for me hopeful with the President Trump's administration is the renewed focus on the private sector, making sure that the private sector is leveraged to provide alternatives and not overly constrained in terms of the way and where we can help. Also, there is a question, I believe, which is fundamental, and this goes back to your point about institutions. And so for me, one of the ways in which we're never, as a free market society, we're never going to be able to out-transactionalize the Chinese. And so in many ways, the question is, how do we limit some of the more predatory aspects of their advance? And to me, one of the the things that is critical for that is working with partners to help strengthen their institutions in terms of anti-corruption work, in terms of pushing for transparency, in terms of their ability to evaluate contracts. There are things that are equivalent to what we have in the U.S. for CFIUS. Basically help them to get it right on a level playing field. And my hope is that we continue as we try to figure out, throwing out which wheat and which chaff on some of these programs, that some of those things, working with our partners, we will continue in that direction. And I think at the end of the day, another thing which becomes very important is, again, that to give our partners reasons why they want to work with us. And I think, again, this is a balance that I see Secretary Rubio also working to do very well, to show that we care and to apply pressure and to pursue the U.S. interests where appropriate, but at the same way to still give reason to believe that there is an inherent own reason to work with us as a dependable partner.
As I cede back, having gone way over my time, but this has been great, I do want to just underline what Ms. Custer said about we need a Latin America policy, not a countering China in Latin America policy. Latin American nations, a critique that they would have of us is the U.S. policy toward Latin America is always really about somebody else. The Monroe Doctrine, that was really about Europe. It was telling Europe that they couldn't be involved in Latin America. And they worry that we're only interested in them to counter somebody else rather than interested in them. And then even that interest can be episodic. We're worried if there's an immigration crisis, and as soon as it abates a little bit, okay, we're not worried anymore. We're worried if the Soviet Union is doing things in Latin America, then Soviet Union collapsed, we're not worried anymore. So I think the notion of a Latin America policy that's really about Latin American prosperity and stability is good work that can be done, that needs to be done in a bipartisan way between Article I and Article II branches. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. And with a little footnote that I'd still like to come back to some of my questions, I will yield to the good senator from Oregon.
Thank you very much, Chair Curtis. Good to see you in the chair's seat. You have so much power now. Well, I wanted to go back to a journey of December 2023 when a group of us led by Senator Kane went down to Guatemala. President-elect Arevalo had been here. A couple of us had met with him, and he said, I may never actually become president, either because they will invalidate the election or I'll be assassinated. And I asked him, would it be helpful if a group of us come down before the installation to show American support for the integrity of the election and the integrity of the democratic process? And he said, that's the single best thing you could do. So we went. And while we were there, the Attorney General of the country invalidated the elections. And we immediately did a press conference and stood up for the integrity of the elections, the integrity of democracy. Some European delegations did the same day, and by the end of the day, the then president, the outgoing president, said he would stand by the elections and the installation. I was very, very pleased to see America standing up for democracy, standing up for integrity of the process. President Arevalo ran on economic development for the whole nation, and that really made a huge impact on the indigenous population, recognizing they had a champion in him, which they often didn't have in a president in Guatemala, and his effort to take on corruption. And you just mentioned corruption a moment ago. Now we are cutting programs that support anti-corruption and support economic development. What impact will those cuts have on the stability or success of Arevalo's effort to improve living and stability and take on corruption and establish a better democracy?
Senator, thank you very much for the question. And first, for me, framing to be perfectly clear, my understanding is that the administration is in the process of evaluating the wheat with the chaff, which things make sense to continue in some new form versus what things don't. But for me, and also, frankly, to dovetail off of what Senator Kane said, for me, there is no other region in the world with which what happens, whether for good or bad, most directly impacts the United States through ties of immigration or commerce or security. So understanding that connectedness, I think, is probably the entire committee shares. Understanding that one of the biggest impacts for opening up the doors for China, and we see that with, for example, Venezuela, when, again, frustrations with corruption opened the door for first Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro, or, for example, in Ecuador, talking about how Rafael Correa came to power, or in Bolivia, how Evo Morales first came to power. That frustration with corruption, oftentimes in the sense that governments are not performing, opens up the door for radical left that hijack democracy, and often in terms of who buys the most Chinese arms, who buys the most Chinese security systems, who engages with the Chinese in the most problematic ways. What you see is that when there's a loss of faith in democracy, that often opens up those doors. And so I certainly would concur that helping our partners to succeed as democratic governments in the fights against corruption and other things is important. And at the same time,
you've kind of leapt forward to my second and third questions, but I'll just acknowledge that. I do think that cutting the terminations of foreign aid programs that have included supporting democracy programs and good governance will have an impact. Maybe some of those will be restored. As you say, maybe there's the chaff that can be set aside. I think it's very important to carefully defend the programs that support his efforts in economic development and strengthening the institutions of democracy. But then this has broader impacts, which you've leapt forward to. And certainly if we have a weaker relationship with Guatemala and terminate these programs, creates a more open door for China. But I wanted to ask about one specific aspect. Maybe it's been asked about, but I wasn't here for the rest of the hearing, so I apologize. And that is whether undermining programs in Guatemala might also undermine the ability of President Arevalo to continue to support Taiwan. He's under tremendous pressure to abandon the recognition of Taiwan. We've encouraged him to sustain that, but if we're doing less on economic development, China has the opportunity to say, well, we'll do more, recognize us.
Thank you very much for the questions. I wanted to go back first to your earlier comment about democracy. And I think when you talk about democracy erosion, there's really three things that we need to be looking at with that. One is public apathy. Globally, you're seeing citizen surveys that are uncertain about whether democracy is delivering economic growth. And that is a major challenge, I think, for democracy. I think secondly, is that you do have wealth maximizing, power maximizing politicians that are looking for opportunities to accumulate power. But then you also have motivated external salesmen, and I think that kind of brings us to the point of this hearing. China and Russia and other authoritarian allies are very happy to find ways to demonstrate that their models of development, their models of governance are more attractive, that they will deliver. And I think there's an opportunity for the U.S. to counter that in two respects. One is bolstering Taiwan, who actually has made an effort to demonstrate that you can have development and democracy to be successful. It's not very good about telling its story as a successful democracy, so that's certainly one thing to think about. But two, in terms of the U.S., there is a whole of society approach that we need to be thinking about here. Our civil society, our private sector, our government, engaging in places like Guatemala to shore up democracies. And to do that, you're thinking about investing in watchdog capacity of civil society, journalists, and whatnot. You're thinking about increasing the technocratic competence of officials in these governments as a counterbalance to politicians, and then investing in accountability. I would like to see the U.S. continue to be a voice and put resources behind doing these things from a government perspective. But at minimum, we should also be working with our private sector and civil society actors to shore that up further.
So I'm over my time, but I just want a kind of a yes/no if possible. Does canceling programs that we support in Guatemala on economic development and democracy building make it harder for Guatemala to maintain its current relationship with Taiwan?
I think we need to get the programs that we support right, sir, and make every program dollar that we spend count.
That wasn't exactly an answer. Okay, so you're going to not answer that one, but how about for you, Ms. Custer?
I am similarly going to give you a non-answer, but I will say that when it comes to fighting economic pressure from China. We've removed an important stick and lever at our disposal. It makes it easier for Guatemala
So
to say it's not worth
you're
it.
the experts, and you don't want to answer the question. So I want to tell you how I think the right answer is. Absolutely, if we undermine our programs with Guatemala, it creates economic pressures that China will see as an opportunity, and that opportunity will go with a requirement that Guatemala abandon its relationship with Taiwan. I think that's the right answer. If we had further time, I'd ask you if you disagree with that, but thanks.
And on that note, I'll turn to a few questions of my own. Ms. Custer, you talked about Taiwan telling its story, and I want to just point out, in 1979, I actually lived in Taiwan, and Taiwan was under martial law at the time. And the United States put a lot of time and energy into our relationship with China, and to some degree, we pulled back, well, not to some degree, we pulled back our diplomatic relationships with Taiwan. And now you let that time pass between 1979 and now, and you have a full-force democracy, prospering, doing well, freedom for their people, and you have, of course, China has gone the opposite direction. And I think that is a fabulous story to tell, one we really should be shouting from the housetops here in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ellis, let me have you put on your former state policy planning staff hat. And did you see evidence of Chinese interference in local electoral processes or overt efforts to sway political leaders to sever their relationships with Taiwan?
Yes, sir. So first of all, I think it's important to understand how it is multifaceted, and I probably should, and I'm going to speak in terms of having followed this for about 20 plus years as an academic, and certainly the unclassified portion of what I saw while I was at the State Department. But what you see again is this weaving of a tapestry of all level. It's the economic blackmail selectively applied that we saw before. It's the whispering in the ears of business lobbies in agricultural and in other sectors. It is the bringing people over to the PRC in terms of journalists or others to try to get favorable coverage and access. It is sometimes the inappropriate things. I'll mention one specific case that I haven't mentioned yet, of course, which was the flip of Taiwan. Now, I've spoken with President Varela, and I know that he would deny that there was a quid pro quo, but it did not go unnoticed among people that right after he flipped to the PRC in 2017, that the family-run business that was in his brother's name suddenly got a really big contract from the PRC. Similarly, it was not unnoticed that his Vice Minister Nicole Wong, again, who I know, a wonderful person, very, very bright person, but after she played a critical role in that flip. Literally just months later, she got a very cushy job representing China Harbor Engineering Corporation. And so I think there's this sense of, both the offers and does China play dirty, and including some of the more, the indirect electoral things. And if I may, just one more thing, and Ms. Custer also alluded to this, but really to emphasize the promise of benefit is often an unrealized promise. I have done several studies which have been published looking at IMF data, in which you actually see that if you look at the 2 to 3 years after recognition, when you include both what is lost from Taiwan and what is gained from the PRC, in almost every single case, it is either flat or it falls. In part, that's because some of the traditional products, such as coffee and fruit, there's no real reason for the PRC to bring them in refrigerated containers halfway around the world when they can get the same product from Vietnam or the Philippines. That's oftentimes a symbolic thing. At the same time, their export agencies oftentimes don't have the expertise that they need. And indeed, when you look at the actual investment projects, there's a certain amount of work that is done, paid for by those countries, but not in Panama, not in Costa Rica with the disastrous Route 32 project, not in the Dominican Republic, where something like $600 million of electricity projects were promised that never happened, not even in El Salvador, where there's talk about La Union. In almost every single case, those promises have been empty, but it's those hopes that often are sold, whereas I think that the benefits that Taiwan provides, often right-sized for our partners, are something that's much more tangible to their benefit.
Thank you. Ms. Custer, did you want to comment on that?
Yes,
Sure.
please, sir. So first, picking up on this, we call that buyer's remorse. You asked me earlier, Senator Kane, about how we see things differently in Latin America than in other parts of the world. One is the newness of a lot of these relationships. I field surveys of private, public, and civil society leaders in 141 low and middle income countries, including many in Latin America. And what you see are differences in how leaders think about what they've gotten in the relationship with China. And you see a lot more skepticism and doubt starting to flood in places like East Asia and Pacific, for example, where these countries have a longer history with a lot of these projects, where you're starting to see not only the promises, but the delays, the disruptions, the challenges environmentally, challenges with governance and corruption. And so this has soured things a little bit. Other studies have shown that China gets a public perception bump when it announces a new project, but it actually has a decline at the end of these projects. So those are the stories that actually aren't really being told yet in Latin America, but there's an opportunity there for learning. And then,
Before you leave that, can I ask us, can you bifurcate the difference between that reaction from people on the ground and the leaders? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I talk about leaders, it's a fairly broad way of defining it. So mid to senior government officials, civil society leaders, private sector leaders. Typically, these leaders are thinking about a slightly different set of agenda items than citizens. Citizens are often historically undecided when it comes to China, but you do see a souring of public opinion, mostly in terms of reaction to news media, but also a souring when it comes to what's happening in particular communities that are affected by these projects. When it comes to leaders, what is a more compelling case is, where am I going to get financing for infrastructure projects? And I'm looking to China. And so there is a little bit of a difference there, but even in places like the East Asian Pacific region, you're seeing a souring on both counts.
Very good. So I'm going to still put my bookmark down, but yield to the senator from Florida. Welcome.
Thanks. Well, thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here. So, first off, do you think China's our friend? Either of you think their government has decided they want to do whatever's in the act in the best interest of America? Either of you?
Do I think that China is our friend? I'm not sure that friend is necessarily the vocabulary choice that they would choose. I think they view the U.S. as a superpower. It is someone that they can't ignore. It's somebody they have to accept and find ways to work with. The question is more about managed competition. So in what areas are we going to compete? In what areas are we going to cooperate? That's not quite the same thing as a friend, but it is someone you have to live with.
For me, Senator, thank you for the question. The Chinese people are our friends. The Chinese people are human beings living in an oppressive communist system, which, fundamentally, through the dominance of government, crushes the initiative that they have and the freedom that they have. Now, looking at China as a system, what I'd certainly say is that, for me, the objectives of the Chinese Communist Party and the leadership of the Chinese state, it's all about China. It's about capturing as much value added for the Chinese as possible. It's about the restoration of the military and other power of the Chinese state after what they see as 150 years of humiliation. But what that implies is the question of whose security is taken away, whose democratic systems is taken away, in whose interest do international organizations and institutions flow, whose liberty is lost, whose territorial claims are lost. If we look at the advance of the PRC in the South and East China Sea with the militarization of reefs and shoals and what they've done with the Philippines and the Vietnamese and others. And at the end of the day, creating the dilemma for us that, if we have to someday fight against the PRC because of Taiwan or something else, that is going to be a horrific challenge. And so,
Let me interrupt you for a second, make it easier. So, do you think a friend would give your kids fentanyl? Do you think a friend would do that? No. Answer is pretty simple. They wouldn't do that. Do you think your friend would sign a document that they are going to comply with some organization or some trade deal and completely lie? I don't think so. Do you think a friend would try to steal your job? Probably not. You think your friend would try to take the property of your next-door neighbor? Probably not. So that's the party, the Communist Party, right? Okay. So how do you think that when you see the Communist Party do what they're doing, how are we supposed to try to be helpful to Taiwan? What would be the biggest ways we can be helpful to Taiwan?
So first of all, to ensure Taiwan's survival as a democratic autonomous entity, to make sure that, as happened with Hong Kong in violation of the commitments to Hong Kong, that Taiwan's autonomy is not crushed, in part because it is in our security interest to do so. And
okay. What would you do? What would you do that we're not doing?
So a range of different things, sir, but number one is to make sure—
give me the top three.
To have a clear commitment backed by military and other capabilities to be able to defend the autonomy of Taiwan is fundamental to U.S. long-term security interests in Asia. And as part of that, also to resist encroachment on Taiwan and its group of friends in the Americas and other places in order both to help maintain the autonomy and friends of Taiwan, but also as a vehicle to restrict China's advance.
How about you? What are your top three things that we ought to do to help Taiwan? Or do you think we should?
In terms of helping Taiwan directly, I mean, I think there's a question as to how much does formal recognition matter versus broadening the support base of actors that see the value of an independent Taiwan. And I think a lot of the conversation earlier in this hearing had focused around how do you actually claw back wins from a lot of these actors? How do you push countries across the recognition chain? So, you know, those that aren't recognizing Taiwan at all right now, having a liaison office, how do you actually get the incentives right for partners in the region to do this? For those that maybe are opening up the door to full recognition, how do you move up that chain? So I think a lot of the conversation that we've had thus far has been about how do you get the economics right? How can the U.S. actually be part of the solution together with Taiwan to broker economic opportunities for countries to stay on board?
Do you think we should buy? Do you think we should continue to try to buy everything we can from China when they want to demolish our way of life, kill our citizens, build a military to defeat us, lie about every deal they ever did? Do you think we ought to stop buying their crap?
I think I would answer the question by saying it is in the interest of the U.S. to diversify its supply chains, to diversify its trading partners. And Latin America is a great place to do that. We could be doing more to build and buttress our relationships from a trading perspective there. That's a win for the U.S., that's a win for Taiwan, and it's a win for the region.
For me, I think there's a lot more that we can do in terms of restricting PRC's ability to obtain the technology, especially the technology that help in areas such as AI and other things that both represent military threat and strengthen the Chinese state, and also allow a dominance of certain industries that in a globalized form undercut our ability to compete. In addition to that, I think there's more that we can do with financial sanctions. I think there are certain areas where we need to make sure that we don't do more to undercut our own strength in trying to move away from working with the PRC. So I think there are some areas where we certainly can cooperate and have economic, but we absolutely do, I believe, need to understand, as you pointed out, Senator, that we are in a very serious competition, and we need to make sure not only that we preserve the autonomy and democracy of Taiwan, but also our own strategic space and being able to compete against the PRC and not find ourselves in a position where we are technologically outmatched, militarily outmatched, and otherwise by allowing certain economic things. So I think there's a lot more that we can arguably do if we do it intelligently in that space, sir.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. Sincere thank you to both of our witnesses. Thank you for dealing with our little recess there. For information of the members, the record will remain open until the close of business tomorrow, March 27th. We ask that the witnesses respond as promptly as possible. Your responses will also be made part of the record. With my thanks to the ranking member and on both of us, we thank everybody for being here. The hearing's adjourned.